Now, they've gone a long time without food, and Paul stood up and said, I like this about Paul. Men, you should have taken my advice.
I told you so. The classic, I told you so.
Remember when I said it was going to be a disastrous journey? You should have taken my advice not to sail from Crete. Then you would have spared yourself this damage and loss. But now I urge you to keep your courage, because not one of you will be lost, only the ship will be destroyed. I've been thinking a lot about Paul, and what has been on my mind is how he is truly a combination of law and grace. And we see that happen to him on the Damascus road, where he literally is going in hot-headed on the law, and Jesus comes and shows him the power of grace. But we see that even more throughout his journey. And now that we're on episode 4, our last session about Paul, we see how Paul is focused on grace and love and unity. And that's what he really wanted for his church and for the believers, the members of the way. So I see a transformation in Paul over time, but a lot of his attributes are still there. Would you agree with that, Jeremiah? His early attributes?
Absolutely. I mean, he definitely seems a little more relaxed or not as eager to pick a fight as he was. Maybe not pick a fight, but just be confrontational in his youth. But it's still very Paul, right? From the moments of when he meets the Sanhedrin and Pharisee, or the Sanhedrin with the Pharisees and the Sadducees, and just how he postures himself, how he waits until somebody's about to whip him to claim his Roman citizenship, because I think he knew that would create some chaos. But there's a softer side that we see that I don't know if we would have seen earlier at the end of, was it chapter 21, when the people are warning him not to go to Jerusalem. And he says, why are you breaking my heart? Why are you doing this to me? And I don't know if we would have seen that side of Paul, the 30-year-old Paul. What are your thoughts?
Well, I definitely think that Paul has grown. I mean, he's gone through so much already. The 3 missionary journeys, he's planting churches, he's going back and checking on the people, sharing the word of God, sharing the message of Jesus, and trying to unite these 2 very distinct group of people, the Jews and the Gentiles, which has not been an easy task, but it is what he's charged to do. So I think he himself has to show how he has changed based on his encounter with Jesus, in order for others to see the power of Jesus in his life. And so as for where we are now, just as you said, we're at the beginning of Acts 21. And it is at this point that Paul decides to go back to Jerusalem. And you mentioned that the people there were not in Ephesus, were not too keen on Paul going back, but he felt that he must go back. And the question is, we have this tension, you brought it up, between what Paul wanted to do and what people were telling Paul he should or should not do. What do you think that's about?
Well, it's weird to me because I think there's another layer on that of what people want, what the people want Paul to do. Specifically, the people in Ephesus that were warning Paul not to go back were warned by the Holy Spirit, right? The Holy Spirit told them what would happen to Paul if he went back. So it wasn't just, hey, I don't want you to go back. It almost feels like the Holy Spirit gave them information to make them not want Paul to go back. Now, why? I don't know. I mean, there's this part of the story I've always been really confused by, because Paul seems dead set on going to Jerusalem and then going to Rome. But you look at, there's multiple warnings not to do it along his journey. And there's multiple times where he could have gotten out of it and he doesn't, right? Through his own decisions. So I'm always curious, is this because God really wanted Paul to go to Rome? Or is this because Paul really wanted to go to Rome? Now, it worked out for our benefit either way, and it might just be a conversation of semantics, but it's just fascinating me to go through this. This is what I'm always left with of this part of the story.
Well, I mean, I think it could be that the people were being warned by the Holy Spirit of what's going to happen to Paul, that he's going to suffer. But, Paul already knew that. And he said so from the very beginning, that when he had his encounter with Jesus, and he realized that on the Damascus Road, and he realized that Jesus is the Messiah, the fulfillment of the entire story of which he knew so very well. I think that the Lord also said to him, you will suffer many things, so prepare to suffer. So suffering was something that he'd become so familiar with that if you're going to try to stop Paul from doing something, I'm not sure you would use the suffering angle, because he's like, hey, that's been going on for years and years now. And he must have felt determined that this is what he needed to do. And so he does. And good thing that he did, in my opinion, because from it is such a fruitful period of Paul's life. The incarceration leads to just a huge body of work that he produces while he's in prison, if you will.
Yeah, he probably
Rome.
never sat still long enough prior to do it.
Yeah, I mean, I think he had so many thoughts in his head, but he was always on the road. But in this case, we are now in about 57 AD. Paul is around 50 years old. He travels not that far from Ephesus by land and sea to get back to Jerusalem. And when he arrives, he has Timothy with him. And they are greeted by the local church leaders who are so very happy. And Paul details what they had been doing all along the way. And when the leaders heard him, they said to Paul, you see, brother, how many thousands of Jews have believed, and all of them are zealous for the law. And they had been informed about how you teach the Jews who live among the Gentiles to turn away from Moses. So there's some conflict that's developing here because, there's Jews, the Judaizers, who want people still to become Jews before they can be Christians. And Paul is teaching the message of grace. You don't have to do that. But remember, the church leaders had said to Paul, we agree with you. And there's only a few things that you need to do. But in this case, he brought Timothy. And because the Judaizers were still in Jerusalem, they suggest, hey, you should go ahead and do a purification ritual to show these Jews that you are still, a member, you're still a Jew, right? And so he goes ahead and does that, this 7-day purification ritual. And that should have been enough for them to accept that Paul was still a practicing Jew, if you will. But instead, they sort of raise up a kerfuffle, like I said before, about the fact that they kind of speculate that he had brought a different Gentile into the court area where the Gentiles weren't allowed at the temple, and that causes them to be furious. And so then they, basically start a riot, if you will. And this is all in Acts 21, the riot to such an extent that it looked like they were basically going to kill him. They dragged him from the temple. The gates were shut. While they were trying to kill him, news reached the commander of the Roman troops that the whole city of Jerusalem was in an uproar. So what is this reminiscent of? It's kind of reminiscent to me of another event.
Absolutely. I mean, when the last time I recall scripture talking about this group of people, they were capturing somebody and trying to kill them as well, which makes me curious how often they did this activity, right? They kind of knew how to maneuver this way, which was bizarre when you actually think what they are, right? they're a religious theological council. And one of the first tools it seems like they pull out of their belt is to, oh, I'm going to kill you if you disagree with us is a bit bizarre. There's obviously a lot culturally I don't understand of that time. But from our modern optic, it's like, guys, you might want to relax. I also find it interesting how they, some of the insults. There was, you dine with uncircumcised men was one of the lines that was said to Paul. I'm like, we're still here. We're still talking about these things, right? When we earlier in Acts talked about how they came to a conclusion on this, right? So clearly there's a group of people that are mad about that conclusion, that are mad about everything. And as we've talked about in, our Journey to Calvary series, how much of this was people protecting their religion? How much of this was people protecting their way of life, tradition? I mean, you stir the pot of all these things and you get people that are not, their hearts are going to be hard and they're not listening to the message of Christ through Paul.
That's right.
The one thing
they'd done this to Stephen. They'd done it to Jesus. It was a response to what they considered to be blasphemy. And they were so zealous for the law that it really evoked a strong reaction, something that I don't think that we can totally relate to as followers of Jesus.
The thing that struck me in this part of the story is when they were asking Paul, and I think it was this part of the story where he gave his testament of what happened on his road to Damascus.
Yeah. He does it more than once, but this is the first time he does it.
And he recites it like very clearly, word for word. So again, it goes back, obviously, but it just reminds me of the impact that had on his life, that moment. And he's still reaching for it years later in that providing clarity of why the way that he is and pleading with people. I think essentially like, this is what changed me. This is what should change you as well.
Yeah, for sure. Like he has said this story many times because he's traveled and he's told the same story. This is one of his primary arguments about why he is who he is, why he's become a believer, and why others should become believers in Jesus. But here he's saying it in Jerusalem to the Jews who are hostile towards him. And you know what? That doesn't go very well. N.T. Wright says about this that Paul returned to Jerusalem aware that his presence was both a gesture of unity and an invitation to turmoil. He knew the risk, yet he acted with the heart of a pastor. And this too, that his aim was never to undermine Jewish customs, but to champion the gospel's power to unite believers from every corner. So he had the right intention, a very good heart about it, but he was speaking to a group of people, as you said, who didn't have an open heart about it. And this leads to him being put into jail.
Leads to them trying to kill him.
Right.
Then as a saving mechanism from killing him, he's put into jail.
Yeah, it's true. And he says, I'm a Roman citizen. And so they save him. And then they take him to the Sanhedrin. And then again, he says the same sort of message, but also kind of geared more towards what the audience he was in, right? He's in front of the Sadducees and the Pharisees, like he said.
He essentially says, I was one of you, or at least one of half of the room.
Right. And, there's basically, what can they do about that? The Pharisees are arguing that the man is right, the thing that he's saying, who are we to judge whether he has had a message from God? And
but here's a question for you. Did they actually think he was right, or was this just he's on my team, so therefore I got to vote for him? Because I got from that part of that story.
It could be supporting your side, right? Like he's on my team. Well, they may have already known of him and about him. So yeah, I don't know. What do you think?
I think it's political. Hey, he's on our team. We're right. You're wrong. We're going to support our guy. And I think he knew what he was doing there, too. I mean, Paul, again, he goes back to he was trained in the art of debate. He was trained in the thought of law of that era, right? He was incredibly intelligent. I think that he knew that he needed to make a political maneuver here otherwise he wasn't leaving that room.
Well, I mean, you're right. It was a political maneuver, but you did have two distinct trains of thought between the Pharisees and the Sadducees.
Mm-hmm.
They were not in agreement about theology. I mean, that's the clear way to say it, that the Pharisees did believe in life after death. They did believe in angels, and they did believe in resurrection, and the Sadducees did not. So it wasn't just a debate about who's going to leave the room. It was a debate about what do you believe versus what do I believe. So I could think some of their supporting Paul had to be from his theology, why they were supporting him. Yeah. But what's interesting in this passage is that in Acts 23, after he'd been taken back to the barracks, in verse 23:11, the following night the Lord stood near Paul and said, "Take courage. As you have testified about me in Jerusalem, so you must testify in Rome." So I suppose there's your answer. Did Paul think he should go because he wanted to or because the Lord wanted him to? I suppose he got the word that he was going to Rome. So
yeah, I agree that could be taken from there. I find it interesting the point in this story when he was told that. It seemed like after he was already made his moves to get there.
Yeah, I suppose so. I mean, Rome wasn't in view right now. He's just trying to figure out how not to get killed, right?
Well, I mean, I guess, I don't know. I mean, he clearly at this moment seems like he's trying not to get killed. But at the same time, clearly he knew leaving Ephesus, he was going to be killed. So
yeah,
it's
Did he know clearly? I'm not so sure. He said, "I'll never see you again." But what does that mean?
So this story has some really bizarre moments, Like the dude took in Ephesus, there was a guy that took Paul's belt and wrapped it around himself and said, "This is what the Spirit told me is going to happen to the wearer of this belt if he goes to Jerusalem." So yeah, I'm pretty sure Paul knew what was going to go down. Now, obviously I don't think he was there he didn't sign up for a death mission per se, like he wanted that to outcome, but that it goes back and forth in the way that I read the narrative.
Well, all of the apostles were facing the same thing. They were all facing the same thing. I think they all knew it was unlikely they were going to get out of it with their lives. Their mission was really about their entire lives. We only know of John, who survived this age to become an old man. So maybe he did have I agree with you, he probably had some foresight that based on how things were going so far, it wasn't likely that he was going to live a long life somewhere off on his own, where he could just be in peace. That didn't happen. So what happens next is also weird, right? What happens after this? He's in the barracks, and his sister's son overhears the story about how the Jews have decided they're going to kill him. And that, I mean, they're so focused on killing him, they're not even going to eat until they've accomplished the mission to kill Paul.
Which is, I mean, and how much the story puts an emphasis, like they're not going to eat, and they said drink as well, right?
Yeah.
Until he's dead.
A solemn oath.
And there's 40 of them?
Yeah.
So it's not just one radical dude. There's a whole big bunch of people.
Yeah, there's 40 of them. They're like, okay, you have to get the Romans to bring him back in front of the Sanhedrin so that we can jump him along the way and murder him. And now Paul's sister's son, so his nephew, overhears this and goes to the Roman commander and says, "Hey, this is what's going to happen. There's going to be an ambush." And I'm kind of surprised they believe him, but they do believe him, right?
Well, because the guy became friendly with Paul, right? I assume Paul was just hardcore pressing this guy with the gospel like every second he could, and the guy took a liking to Paul.
Yeah, I mean, that's a good way to look at it. So after that happened, the centurion, the commander, calls upon his centurions and ordered them, get ready a detachment of 200 soldiers.
And 70 horses, right?
70 horses and 200 spearmen. So all together, 400 men to go to Caesarea.
And then a mount for Paul, too. Like, hey, get a horse for Paul.
Yeah. And they take him to Governor Felix in Caesarea Maritima, which is on the water there. It's on the Mediterranean. So from Jerusalem to there, it's probably, I don't know, I'm going to say 70 miles or so.
Okay.
And so they take him during the night, and they spend one night there to this, they end up in this one town, and then they take him all the way to Caesarea. And I guess the plot was foiled with the 40 men. Yeah.
Which I love how the story never goes back to what happened to their oath, right?
Yeah.
Because obviously they did kill him, and they said they weren't going to eat or drink until they killed him. So did they all die from starvation, or they'd be like, I'm going to eat something?
Well, he's gone. I mean, what can they do at that point, right? So now he's in Herod's palace at Caesarea Maritima, which is an absolutely gorgeous palace right there on the water. And if you go there today, they'll show you what they say is Paul's cell. I mean, who knows for sure? But they go there and they tell him that, you're going to have to be heard by a Roman governor. And it's kind of a funny story. In seminary, people would always talk, was it Felix or Festus? Because their names are similar. First there's Felix, and then there's Festus. So, he's in front of two Roman governors, which is, again, just, I don't know, it's like Paul is just moving up the food chain of the government, isn't he?
Yeah, and it's amazing how he's moving up the food chain and the amount of resources the Romans are putting in to protect him.
Yeah.
I mean, again, like the large military attachment to move those people, to just move, the logistics behind that move is mind-boggling, actually, when you think about it. The amount of money that was spent on that, right? And then he's getting an audience. And meanwhile, like, they're putting him up. I mean, I guess there was a line of his friends that can take care of him, but there's still a room. I mean, and because he's not like confined to a cell, he's under more of like a house arrest situation.
It just didn't work that way in that time. Like, they didn't provide you 3 square meals and, a prison environment. They left it to people to care for you. So
right.
I think Paul thought, I'm not going anywhere. He wasn't going to try to run away at this point. But yeah. So it's interesting because in Acts 25, we find that the governor, who is Felix, not Festus, is interested in what Paul has to say, right? Mm-hmm. And they spend a fair amount of time going back and forth about it. And he spends about 2 years there. He's 2 years. He's in this region for 2 years. So it's not just a quick trial and then off we go to Rome. He's there and he's sort of forced to defend himself over and over again. Wright says this. He says, in these tense proceedings, Paul was forced to clarify the core of his message. He faced not only Roman law, but also the hardened fears of those clinging to old boundaries. And yet, every trial became an unexpected platform for Paul to advocate the liberating message he had first brought to Gentile believers. Yeah. So, he's getting the opportunity to speak his mind and to make his argument, which in a way feels like the Romans are a bit more open, or at least they're more fair, right? They seem to be more fair, in my opinion.
Yeah, there's probably just a lot I don't understand about Roman culture of that time and how their law worked. I am fascinated that they kept him locked up for they kept following this through. You would have think they would have said, hey, let's either come to a ruling or let him go. Mm-hmm. And on the other side of that coin, it's amazing to me that the Jewish religious folks kept pushing the issue. Like, I would kind of think just human nature to be like, hey, he's out of sight, he's out of mind. Let's not worry about this. Or I mean, like, it just atrophy happens to the whole thing, right? The fact that they're still wanting him dead. I mean, he's been gone for 2 years. Like, no, let's go kill him.
Well, yeah. I mean, even in Caesarea Maritima, you had a fair number of Jews who lived there. Mm-hmm. So it wasn't like it was totally a unified Roman city, because it had been a Jewish location before Herod built one of his palaces there on the water. So, and it's not that far from Jerusalem, really. Mm-hmm. But I have to say, to your question about the Romans, they were a very civilized society if you were a civilized person. And you were granted a lot of freedom and also just a lot of benefits to being a Roman citizen. And so I think they did approach this more as well, why should this matter to us? It sounds like you're having, yet again, a problem with identifying what your faith is about. Mm-hmm. It sounds very much of like what happened with Jesus, and now here we are again. He's breaking your rules, but we don't care about your rules. We only care about our rules. Like, as long as you're not breaking our rules, why should we care?
Right. And also, we can't just let you go kill whoever you want, because that just hurts society.
Exactly. So it is at this point, though, like he's full on board with, I'm a Roman citizen and I need the protection. And so, he continues with that argument. Eventually he ends up in front of Festus. Is that right? I probably have him wrong. Oh, no, wait. Let's see. Yeah. So he's in front of Felix first. And then they change. Felix leaves, says, now Festus is going to take up your case. And he's there in front of Festus. And Festus spends a bunch of days, a bunch of time listening to him. And, Festus says, are you willing to, Festus wants to bring in, sorry, I got a little confused here. Festus wants to bring in some witnesses, which makes some sense. He's like, okay, a lot of talking, much has happened. How can we move it forward? Let's bring in some witnesses who will speak to what Jesus or Paul has done. And ultimately, Paul says, I'm going to appeal to Caesar instead. And that's what happens. He says, okay, then you're going to have to go in front of Caesar. So I kind of wonder when I read this, like, did he pull the Caesar card too early? Because it says, I probably would have let you go if you hadn't appealed to Caesar. So, yeah.
Yeah, that what was Paul's will? What was the divine will of God? We'll never know in this. It's probably a little bit of a Rorschach test, depending on how you believe about God, of what you think this is. And maybe Paul just knew the only way that he would not be hunted day and night is ultimately have the Roman protection. And the only way to continue that would be to get to Caesar. Although the protection doesn't work out that well for him.
It doesn't. I think it kind of does.
Well, the whole the transportation, getting there, the shipwreck. Okay,
well, let's talk about that, because now he's going to Rome. It's like 59, 60 AD. He's 22, 23 years old. Now he's got to go 2,000 nautical, 52 to 53. So now he's got to go 2,000 nautical miles, which is. The way they set up this whole sailing thing is that they're taking him to Rome, but it's not the best time of year to go. That's what I get out of it, right?
Right. It's right before winter, right?
Right. Yeah. Like if you're going to sail this might not be the best time. And I understand it's true that around the Greek islands in particular, around that whole Mediterranean, it can be really bad weather-wise.
Okay.
So in any case, they decide to go. And even though they're like, we shouldn't go, they go. Then there's this huge storm. And that whole scene about what happens on the boat in the storm and before the storm is really interesting.
Absolutely, because I think another interesting fact is it's not like they chartered a boat for Paul to get to Rome. It's like, okay, you're going to have to kind of, here's how shipping works, go hop some rides, right?
Yeah.
So, and each one gets a little harder until, like you said, the cargo ship that he finds himself on, that the storm happens, or a crazy storm happens. And didn't even Paul tell them, hey, if we go, something bad's going to happen?
Yeah, I mean, he did say that, but he says in Acts 27, Paul warned them, "Men, I can see that our voyage is going to be disastrous and bring great loss to the ship and cargo, and to our own lives also." But they're like, well, regardless of what you say, we're going to go. And they leave with this gentle south wind, and they see that as an opportunity to go ahead and go. But then a hurricane shows up, a nor'easter, they called it. And it was caught in the storm, and they were kind of driven along, and now they're kind of bumping along the islands there. They were afraid that they were going to run aground. And then they started throwing stuff off the ship in order to stay buoyant, I guess, so they didn't run aground. And they haven't had food. It's been a rough ride. Now, they've gone a long time without food, and Paul stood up and said, I like this about Paul. "Men, you should have taken my advice."
I told you so. The classic, I told you so.
Remember when I said it was going to be a disastrous journey? You should have taken my advice not to sail from Crete. Then you would have spared yourself this damage and loss. But now I urge you to keep your courage, because not one of you will be lost, only the ship will be destroyed. Last night, an angel of the God whose I am and whom I serve stood beside me and said, "Do not be afraid, Paul. You must stand trial before Caesar. And God has graciously given you the lives of all who sail with you. So keep up your courage, men, for I have faith in God that it will happen just as he told me. Nevertheless, we must run aground on some island." So, right, like.
Which is so funny, is you hear these stories and they're kind of like sub-stories in scripture, right? And like, but this is the most wild thing ever.
Yeah.
I mean, a shipwreck or a ship out in the middle of a giant storm, let's call it a hurricane. They're starting to throw their cargo overboard, which, if a sailor starts to throw cargo overboard, it's a problem, right? Because you're not getting paid now. Like, all this is for nothing. Then it even says they throw their tackle over.
Yeah.
Right?
Like everything.
I mean, so now you no longer can move, right? That's your sails, that's your ropes, that's all that good stuff that it'd be like today, like, hey, I'm going to throw my engine out of the boat because I'm not scared, right? Then this dude is like, "Oh, by the way, an angel came to me last night, and I told you should have done this.
It's all going to be fine." But then I like how some of them try to escape. And he says, "No, you better not, because if you try to get on the lifeboat, you're going to die." And they come back to the boat. It's like...
It's like, maybe we should listen to this guy after all.
I guess so. And so, then he finally says to him, "It's been a long time, 14 days. Go ahead and take some nourishment because you're going to need it." And ultimately, the boat runs aground. The boat is wrecked, and now they are on Malta. And N.T. Wright says that Paul's calm in the storm demonstrated his confidence that God's plan would stand, even when the vessel and its passenger felt lost. Like, I have to give the guy credit that if an angel comes to him and says, you know what? You're going to be in front of Caesar. He 1000%. It's like whatever it takes to get from here to there, it doesn't matter. If the boat is wrecked and we're on Malta and we get another ship and eventually I'll get there because this is what God has told me is going to happen. And N.T. also says, this is kind of interesting, this voyage embodied the wider gospel dynamic, steering a fragile ship of faith throughout turbulent waters towards the promise of a new horizon. A ship of faith. I like that visual. He's steering that ship to where it needs to be. And as long as you're with Paul, you're safe. Yeah. So, and he's encouraging people in that moment and probably also, of course, speaking about his faith. So,
well, there's another, so we go to another random moment again in the story that just seems like mythology practically, right? It's so just crazy. If they crash on this island or shipwreck on this island, Malta, right? Mm-hmm. But waiting for them is the inhabitants of this island, and they have a fire going, right? Because they're and they're friendly to them, which is just interesting to me. Hey guys, your ship just died. Come here, we're gonna warm you up, right? Because it's cold. I mean, again, it's sometime
winter.
In the fall, so this is probably November-ish. Just put that in our brains. Whether scholars might disagree, and please do. And then Paul's got a bunch of sticks to help because he's a good guy. He's helping make the fire. And a viper comes out. And he pulls his hand out and the viper's hanging. And then there's this conversation of, he must be a murderer or a bad guy because the viper got him. But then they're well, no, he just survived a shipwreck. They're so they're all confused. And Paul just shakes it off and goes about his business, and then nothing happens. They're he must be a god. What? How is this in the middle of this story? Just out of nowhere, a snake gets Paul.
I mean, that whole story has manifested itself in people believing they can handle snakes and that they can handle poisonous snakes. We are not
condoning this activity.
I know. And I just think, well, it's another time and place, and Paul's another person, a different person. Then to bring that into the church seems so weird to me.
Well, also, it's not he willingly handled a snake. He was trying to build a fire.
I know. But the fact that he lived, proof of faith, I don't know. Nevertheless, it is a bizarre moment, for sure, right?
And then they take care of these people for 3 months, right?
Mm-hmm. Yes, and they heal them. They cure them.
Oh, yeah. Paul heals a bunch of people there.
Yeah, which is great because we see that he healed them by placing hands on them. The rest of the sick on the island came and they were cured. So Paul is performing miraculous events of healing here, which I think it shows you that Paul had power beyond what any human does. And he was given that from the Lord in several places and in several ways. So finally they ended up in Rome. And again, he goes through the discussion with the Jews there about his story, and he's still trying to plead his case, but, he's now under house arrest, and he's still a loud visitor. And as I said, he continues to preach all through Acts 28 about Christ and God's kingdom. N.T. Wright says, though physically confined, Paul's theological imagination flourished, insisting no chain could hinder the purposes of God. So this is actually the time when he is writing a tremendous amount of his letters. It's almost like you said in the beginning, he has time now. He's not going anywhere. He only has one trial in front of him. And so he has all of this time in prison. He's there for 2 or 3 years. And he writes all these letters, the prison epistles, they're called, Ephesians, Philippians, Colossians, Philemon. He had already written Romans, before his journey to Jerusalem in 57 AD. And all of these letters really pour out his heart for his people, for the people that he had brought to Christ, and his pastoral feelings about his mission. And his message is primarily about unity. So you have to think about this as, even though he knows, like I think about it, like even though he knows the end is coming, he still has this mission in front of him of distributing the letters, which becomes so important, right?
Well, also,
How do you guide the church when you're confined in a prison?
Well, I think we see a bit of his sentimentality in his older age as well, of like he really cares about all of these places. I think my personal assumption, is that these letters are written out of a place of, I care about you, and I want you guys to go continue to do the good work. And he's like, I got time. My life's probably coming to an end. I want this message to reach out to the people that I've encountered, and we helped create this thing together.
Yeah. And, it doesn't actually end, the book doesn't end with his death. That's left up to our, I guess, discussion about whether he was released and went to Spain and then came back and was imprisoned again and then died, or whether he died then. But in either case, we know that he died, for example, before the temple was destroyed in 70 AD. Because there's no mention of it in Acts or any of his letters. Okay. So that's how we know. We date things around its relative, what was happening before the temple was destroyed. But yeah, his body of work is amazing, and he had so many specific things that he wanted to convey to the Corinthians and the Galatians and the Philippians, all the challenges they were facing, divisions, immorality, confusion over things like spiritual gifts, questions about the resurrection. Again, with Galatians, the Judaizers, with the Philippians, encouraging joy in adversity. I mean, we really get the feeling that the early church was under pressure in so many ways. Not just the Jews who were against them, and eventually the Romans who were against them because they started to become persecuted under Domitian, but also the fact, and Nero, but also the fact that they had disunity. Like they didn't know exactly how to go forward as a unified body and how to spread the message and how to live that message. This was a time of confusion and also confusion about what exactly they should do, but desire to serve the Lord. And Paul is the voice in their head about how to do that in a way that's honoring to God. So they definitely needed that, and we're lucky that we have it because we still face the same challenges, don't we?
Yeah, I mean, the amount of confusion, I think we'll look back on it. It's easy to look back and be like, why are they so dumb? But when you think they were literally laying the foundations for this thing, and they were going against religion and human nature, because human nature is to not change, right? The traditions you grew up with are right and correct. And more often than not, they tradition matters, and it is important to us as humans and society. But not always, right? And so the message of the gospel, the message of Jesus changing all of these strongly held beliefs that got intermingled with society and power structures and finance, commerce. It is an unbelievable task, and it's, I think, miraculous that it worked at all, right? It shows how special Paul was and how much God probably watched every step and gave him divine intervention and wisdom, and the Spirit was with him. And we talked about, there's angels, right, telling him messages. Oh, yeah. I don't know if that was a nightly thing. There's a lot of angels in Acts. I mean, angels show up in several places. Actually, the more angels in Acts than anywhere else because... Oh, really? Yeah. I mean, there's Peter's, the angels interceding for Peter to get out of prison. I mean, we just see the presence of the angels helping, assisting the followers of Jesus in order to protect their lives so that it could grow.
I mean,
Because
that's
you
over
had
and
to have
over.
miracles to make it
That's
work.
over and over in the entire Bible, that God is protecting his people, the people of God, so that they're not wiped off the planet. And that has to happen here too, because for certain, if without the ministry, without the way growing in size, it could have easily been snuffed out. But it has to grow far and wide so that, you can't really snuff it out because you don't know who is a member yet, who's not, and it's growing so fast. So I guess I would say that Paul's journey just is a testament to me about somebody who lives fearlessly in faith. Fearlessly. And I really wonder what we could do if we lived the same way. If we lived without fear instead of always trying to balance our faith with the culture. If we said we're just going to do what Christ told us to do and we're going to choose to do that and not worry about what people think and not worry about what the culture says is right, but we just adhere to what Christ says is right, what could we actually accomplish? I think it would be a tremendous amount of good for the entire world.
I agree with you. The next thought that comes to my mind is, how do we ensure that we are doing God's work and we're not like the Sanhedrin? We're not protecting something that is hollow.
Yeah. Well, they weren't really open to the message. They had this hardened heart situation. And I think if we become that way, even in our own faith, if we think that our faith is a set of rules and it becomes legalistic, we're in trouble, or we're leaning towards a legalistic view of our faith. And Paul is so adamantly arguing that it's all about faith. It's nothing that we've done. It's all about grace. It's what God has done for us, not what we do. And whenever we insert ourselves into it, then and we put ourselves in that position of saying that God has enabled me, erroneously, then we're in trouble. But I do believe that God emboldens people to do certain things, and we need those people, and we need those people in our world. So I love Paul. I really enjoyed this journey going on it with you. Gosh, we could have spent months on it. And
yeah, I feel like we barely scratched the surface on the narrative,
and the letters and all of his messages. It's a lot, but it's also important. So thanks for coming along with me on the ride and providing your insight and thoughts about it. It's fun to talk about the crazy journey of Paul, how unique it was, and how he came out with such a strong heart for Christ. So I love that about him. Do you have any concluding thoughts about it?
No, I mean, I think everything you just said was really beautiful. I have nothing to add, but I think you summed it up quite well.
We got to the end of the road with Paul. I'm proud of us. So,
yes.
Looking forward to what's next, Jeremiah. Yeah, go team. All right. Take care. Talk to you soon.
Every day. Bye-bye.
All right. Bye.